Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Goncher. I'm an editor at the New York Times Learning Network, and I'm excited that everybody's here today to talk about how we can teach and learn with graphs from the New York Times. We have guest presenters from the American Statistical Association and from Desmos. We have two teachers joining us as well as 4 students, and I'll be introducing them throughout this webinar. So many of you may not be familiar with the Learning Network. We're a part of the NewYorkTimes.com. And our mission is to help teachers and students teach and learn with the New York Times. That includes articles, op-eds, illustrations, photos, videos, podcasts, and of course, the graphics from the Times. We have a resource sheet that you can find as part of the resources that you can download from this webinar, and that includes all of the URLs that we'll be discussing today. On the Learning Network, we've organized our activities for students into a bunch of different buckets. And one of those buckets is our collection of multimedia, which includes our film club, what's going on in this picture, and what's going on this graph. So you can always, however you get to the Learning Network, whether it's through your favorite search engine or you bookmarked it on your computer, you can always go through our multimedia section to find what's going on in this graph. And then on the what's going on in this graph collection page, we'll feature our latest and most recent graphs that we're having live conversations with and ones that we've recently published. But you can also find our archives, which go back now 2 years. We've published now over 30 graphs. And all of those graphs that we've published are actually still open for comments. If you want to bring your classroom on or have students register at the Times, which is free, and we'll discuss more of that later, then they can participate in conversations that are ongoing there and live. So now let me introduce 2 guests. One is Sharon Hesney, who's a math teacher and a member of the American Statistical Association. She's the one who actually curates our What's Going in this Graph feature. She chooses the graphs. She'll discuss more of how she chooses the graph later. She does the live moderation on Wednesdays, and she writes the reveal each week. And we also have another guest, Dan Meyer, who's the Chief Academic Officer at Desmos. He's a high school math teacher, and he's advocated for better math instruction. Perhaps you've watched his TED Talk or seen him on Good Morning America. So let me welcome those 2 guests right now. Sharon, you're there, and Dan?
Yep.
Happy to be here,
Hi,
folks.
how are you? Talking from Boston.
Okay. Sharon, could you just talk about the protocol that we use with what's going in this graph, and then take us through what's going in this graph activity?
Sure. Okay. So graphs are really tough. They're kind of like poetry. You know, it doesn't come naturally to understand graphs. They're all different. They have many components that contribute to their meaning. And so the A.S.A. and the New York Times Learning Network borrowed from Annie Fetter her strategy of what do you notice, what do you wonder? This is a really great strategy because it has a really low floor. Everybody can notice something, and a really high ceiling. Everyone can, especially when you work together, can get a lot out of the graphs. It encourages curiosity. It appreciates multiple strategies. And we really learn from these graphs because they come from the newspaper, an understanding of the world. What I always was so proud of is when students leave the room, I know they're probably still thinking about the graph that we showed them. After we do what do you notice and what do you wonder, we always ask them for a headline. After all, these are all graphs from newspapers. We want them to be catchy and capture the main idea of the graph. Maybe they're short and there's a little twist. There's just a prize or a play on words. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually do this together. And so we're going to look at last week's graph. It's sources of electricity generation in the United States. Now, you would think this does not seem like a graph students would be interested in. We got 264 responses last week to this, so I guess it was engaging. Maybe it's the colors or something. Let's do it together, and what I want you to do is write in the chat box what you notice and what you wonder about the graph. Start off with I notice or I wonder. Now, if we were doing this in your class, I would really strongly suggest that you do the 2 questions together, but we're trying to move this along a little bit more quickly. So let's take a few minutes. What do you notice? What do you wonder?
So Thomas has noticed that natural gas has been climbing. Jen has noticed that gas and coal seem to swap places toward the end, and they're coming in so quickly that it's hard to read everything that everybody's noticing. Jane noticed that, well, I lost it. I'll wait for it. People have so many noticings that Judy noticed, well, I can't even keep up. Someone noticed that nuclear is pretty constant. Someone noticed about hydroelectric. But Sharon, quite honestly, I can't keep up. Yep.
I don't think there's ever been a case when you do what's going on with this graph and you ask the class, what do you notice, what do you wonder, that you have a lack of answers, because each kid tries to one-up the one after them. I would just bring up a couple interesting things about this graph. One of the things students may ask is, what are those white triangles? Not usual to see something like that. And why are those, natural gas and coal and all, why are they crossing each other? What's happening there? If you look closely at it, there's a big difference in natural gas going from the beginning in 1950s to the present, okay? But coal only goes down 1%, but there's a big crossover there. These are some of the things that are, show a high ceiling in this graph. Now, if you go to the next slide, you're going to see four other graphs that are really similar from different states. The link to the article in the graph shows 50 graphs, and students can see the graphs for their individual states. They can compare the states to each other, or they can compare it to the national distribution of electricity generation by source. This is what's really important in what's going on with this graph. We like to see students do comparisons, because when they compare, they really start understanding the graph. Now let's move on. The day after we release the graph and we have the live moderation, Mike will talk about this later, we give teachers something called the reveal. And in the reveal, there are assorted resources that teachers have. The first thing we do is we give some key insights on the graph. We give you a link to the article so you can look at it for free, okay? There's a shout out to a couple students on catchy headlines that they have or particular comments they've made. Then I give you about 3 to 5 additional questions that you can ask your students. Some are real short and some actually can turn into projects. Finally, there are stat nuggets. Here we take statistical terms and we give you a real basic definition of the term, and then we tell you where you can see it in the graph.
So thank you, Sharon. Let me talk about some of the practical details of how this feature works. So the Thursday before the moderation, we publish the graph. That means it's open for the weekend for students to make responses, and particularly important, it's open for teachers and professors to see the graph, to think about how they may want to use it in their class. At the same time, and Dan will be talking about this more later on, for the spring, we've been collaborating with Desmos, and they've been publishing a graph as well on that Thursday as well. So the graph is available in both places. Then on the following Wednesday, from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern time, we have live moderation. Generally, Sharon is a moderator, and then we also have other math teachers or math professors who also serve as moderators, and they respond to what the students are putting in their comments, and they move the conversation forward. They help students do their noticing and wondering, and we found that it has helped create a certain kind of tone within the commenting, so that students who participate more and more generally learn the language of statistics, and they become better noticers and wonderers, and it can be a powerful tool for students and for teachers. And then the day after, like Sharon was saying, we published the reveal, and Sharon just spoke about that. We have been doing this schedule all year long, and we have 3 more days that we're going to be publishing graphs. We're actually taking a sort of spring break next week, but next Thursday we'll be publishing the next graph. And for that, on April 3rd, then we'll have the live conversation from 9 to 2 p.m. Eastern time. And we'll be having 3 more What's Going in this Graph live conversations. Just to give you a little teaser for the first one, I think we're doing a graph about the arrival of spring. So happy first day of spring. We're also going to be doing a graph related to the songs of summer. And finally, I think we're doing something related to baseball season because it's also the beginning of baseball season. And if you sign up for our newsletter, we'll talk about more about that later on. And just to know what's going on the Learning Network, we're going to be announcing our 2019-2020 schedule later on this year, probably at the end of the summer. So if you sign up for a newsletter, you'll make sure you hear about that when we publish it. Now, I'm really excited that we also have teachers and students joining us. So first, let me introduce Stephanie Grevy from Illinois, and she's joined by two of her 9th grade integrated algebra and geometry students, Shannon Moran and David Benjamin. And I've asked them to join us so they can talk about what this looks like in a 9th grade classroom, how they've been using this feature, and what they think they've learned from it. So welcome, Stephanie, Shannon, and David.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. I've used this graph. I actually got introduced to it by a colleague who also used what's going on in this picture. And they had shared that this is a newer feature a year and a half, 2 years ago, as you had mentioned. And so what I started to do earlier this semester is we were beginning graphical analysis. And one of the things that I noticed is that students often rush to an answer. And I really wanted to give them an opportunity to take time to essentially read a graph, but I also wanted it to be applicable and interesting. And so one of the strategies that I did is I gave them just a few minutes just to kind of soak it in. And so they were just introduced to the graph, and I said, spend some time, look at the axes, look what's going on, what story is it trying to tell? And then from there, we started to use that I notice, I wonder. And to be honest, I fell in love with the strategy. I found myself, ever since that first graph, constantly using this phrase in class, whether it was images or graphs or diagrams. And I constantly be asking students, what do you notice about this? What do you wonder? What questions do you have? And at the same time, I also wanted to give them exposure to these statistical graphs. So as a teacher, I've really, really enjoyed using it. That first graph that you see is the first one that I ever used. And that's exactly what we did. We just spent some time, and it actually kind of foreshadowed material that was coming later in the semester. And so students were actually using vocabulary that they were going to need later, even though they didn't know that at the time. The graph following is the one that I had used with, if you want to show that one with the nutrition graph.
Yep. You should see it now.
Perfect. Yep. So this one I used later in the semester, and I really wanted to focus on claim and evidence. And oftentimes in math class, we want students to explain their reasoning. And one of the things that I noticed is that their responses lacked substance. And I really wanted them to provide more evidence. And so this was just kind of a constant struggle. And so we spent a lot of time, and I rephrased it, and I referred back to what we had done with these New York Times graphs. I'm like, remember when we had to make this claim, or you made this catchy headline? So what we did with this particular graph is we were leaning into claim and evidence in my classroom. And what I had students do is, again, I gave them a graph that applied to them directly. And I wanted them to make a claim about that graph, but yet I wanted them to provide evidence from that graph to defend that claim. And it was really exciting because students, again, were using terminology that I hadn't yet taught. They were making connections from other classes. They were curious. I remember during one conversation, we were doing the I notice, I wonder, and one student was like, I wonder about that. I'm going to look that up right now, and immediately wanted to find the answer. And so it's just been an amazing resource. The one following, I did notice as I was on Desmos, that Desmos in January started also including these graphs. So I thought that was very exciting. So we actually did this yesterday for the very first time with Desmos. And this particular graph is about e-cigarettes, and it compares it with middle school and high school students. Well, this is an extremely relevant topic. especially in high schools. These students, this is what they're experiencing. They're seeing this around them, especially with the vaping, and it's just a very current topic. And I found it to be very interesting, as well as Desmos made it very easy to use. So thank you, Dan Meyer. I appreciate that. But it was, so the graphs are already in there, the I noticed, I wonders, and what I really liked about it was the fact that the students could go back and scroll through and see all of the comments from previous students. And actually what I'll do is I'll let my students kind of speak to them here in just a bit. The two additional graphs that I do have included for the math teachers out there, if you do use this strategy, I then pulled up some other graphs and I gave students choice for homework to choose one and then to do an I notice, I wonder, and just kind of develop some questions and be curious. And then they brought those thoughts and ideas back to the classroom. So if it's okay at this time, I'd like my students to kind of share what they thought about the whole experience. So Shannon and David, what is your reaction to me using New York Times graphs in math class?
At first, I thought it was just a normal graph and like didn't really have like a big deal to it, kind of. But when you really think about it, it's super cool to get the chance to look at this information and have an amazing resource like this. So yeah.
I thought it was really interesting and unique. I felt that I could really connect to these graphs, and it was great how I could implement these into math. I was even able to connect to these to other subjects in and out of school. I typically learn best when real-life examples are applied, and these graphs just fit the criteria I was looking for.
Did you guys find the topics interesting or relevant?
I think the topics were really interesting, and they're kind of vague enough that you can come up with so many different scenarios and interpretations of one graph. So, yeah.
Okay. David?
I thought it was really easy to connect to these graphs and topics because they used everyday issues we as students face. It was really great to have like real statistics and facts that could impact my learning.
Okay. And then I've used this I notice, I wonder strategy since earlier in the year, and you guys have probably noticed like almost every day I'm using I notice, I wonder. So tell us a little bit, has that helped you at all using that strategy, and have you been able to apply that to other content areas or other things that we've done in class?
Yeah, for sure. I think at first the strategy seemed like pretty simple and unhelpful kind of, but after you really keep analyzing the graph, and like you discover new things and you really unfold all the information that's in it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, those strategies also seemed a little weird at first to me. But although after I got into the graphs, I realized how much I noticed things without thinking, because I usually tend to make simple conclusions right away. But this method allowed me to make deeper connections to what I was viewing in the graph. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. And then in addition, Michael, one of the things I would just say to teachers out there is I'm also an instructional coach, and I often find that teachers feel like, well, if this graph isn't directly relevant to what my learning target is, I can't use it. And I want just to say, don't fear about that, because we want students to be curious. These graphs promote curiosity. They promote critical thinking, and students are asking so many questions, and we know that really that's what we want them to do in all of our classes. So it's been an amazing resource. I'm so glad that I've been able to use it throughout the school year, and I'm thankful to you guys for sharing it with us.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephanie, as well as Shannon and David. And we might get a chance to hear from you more when we have a Q&A at the end, if anyone has specific questions for you. I want to use this time as a segue just to talk about the commenting feature on the New York Times Learning Network. If you want your students to participate in a conversation on the Learning Network, what students need to do is they need to register for the NewYorkTimes.com. It's easy and it's fast and it's free to register. That registration just means that you can comment on the Times site. You must be 13 years or older. But what's important for everyone to know is that every single comment is hand moderated by our team at the Learning Network. So we're reading all of the comments and we're deciding whether to approve them or reject them. We approve the vast majority, but we don't allow comments that are uncivil in some way or rude. We really want to promote a civil conversation. We don't want kids to say, "Oh, that's stupid," or "You don't know how to spell," or anything like that. And I think it creates a safe space then in the Learning Network environment. One other thing I want to say, and our next guest may talk about this, but because students can comment from anywhere in the world, you can have students from Singapore and from Montana and New York and France all having a conversation about the same graph. Students can reply to one another. They can read what other students have to say. Eighth graders can read what college students have to say. And so it really also makes an interesting environment, and you get students having a conversation that otherwise would have a difficult time doing that. I'll say this again, but for now I just want to say that all of our student activities on the Learning Network, including what's going on in this graph, are free. So they're not behind the paywall. And if anyone has any questions about that later on, we can answer those. But I want to say that our activities for students, including what's going on in this graph, are completely free. So let me introduce Greg Yarnall and two of his students, Caitlin and Ellie. They're from the Academy of St. Elizabeth in Morristown. And they've been longtime contributors to our What's Going On This Picture feature, which we started maybe back in 2012. So he can tell you, they can tell our audience just about how they've been using those features and how they've been using What's Going in this graph.
Hi, everybody. Indeed, we came from the older version, What's Going On This Picture. I used to do that. I still do it with our 9th grade students here at the Academy. Caitlin, who will speak in a little bit, has done both What's Going On in This Picture and What's Going On in This Graph. So over the time we've been doing this, I had eventually come across what's going on in this graph, and after many faculty meetings about writing across the curriculum and investing writing in all different subjects, I was looking at it as like the last, like Stephanie had said, but giving it to some of our math and statistics people as a way to get some of those math students into some, interpreting of some of their numbers, but then kind of took a second look at it and saw that we could do the same thing over here on the humanities side. A lot of the kids, as they get older in high school, seem to self-select either being a STEM student or a humanities student, and either wanting just numbers that are cut and dry or interpreting things. And I think this exercise really teaches a lot of them that those sort of things aren't mutually exclusive, that you can't really interpret things without understanding the data points behind it, and that numbers, the way that they're presented, can mean different things on each of these different graphs. The one that's up right now on the e-cigarettes, I think, was probably one of the ones that got the most feedback from my students. The current students that use What's Going On in this graph here at the Academy are AP government students, and they range from sophomore to senior. And I think the responses to it came a lot from not just the topic, but how the topic really applied to not to them and to the subject they were studying. So you see, I'm going to give it over to her in a second. You see Ellie's comments right here on this graph, and what I really look for them to do is not just go through the wonder and notice options in investigating what they see, but also to go scroll through the different comments and try to engage in conversation with some of the other students that are interpreting these things, all in the idea that we can have a conversation with people that aren't just in our little school here in New Jersey, but around the world. And I think it gives them a more robust picture of really what's going on. So Ellie's up on this slide, so we're going to have her talk about this one.
Hi, everybody. I think Mr. Yarnell brings up a very good point in the interactive aspect of what's going on in this graph. I think that's one of my favorite parts. Here you see my initial post, just about, yes, what I see and what I wonder. And moderator Sharon asked me a question that brings me to think about something else. And this is very common. Through your initial posts and questions, I know I personally like asking questions on other posts. You get to really expand your thinking together, and which is what I like. It's a communal learning process. Here, I also really like coming up with titles because I think it's fun, and I think it's a good way to figure out what you are really seeing as a whole, and a good way to sum it up. I liked what, I think it was Sharon who said there's a low floor and a high ceiling. I agree with that wholeheartedly, because you see some comments that are pretty simple, and you can really respond and grow in your thinking together. And there's also a high ceiling because almost all of these graphs, in this one and in many, there is a lot of opportunity to make new thoughts and new observances and share them together. So that's one of my favorite parts about what's going on in this graph, and I look forward to it every week.
Thanks. I think Kaitlyns is a little on one of the slide that was actually a graph that was a photo, and that really threw several of the students for a loop. And it kind of exposed one of the things that I find a common mistake, I guess, in a lot of the people who read the graphs, where some of the posts, as I was grading through some of the kids' responses, they were definitely making an attempt to say what they noticed and what they wondered about, and they hadn't read the sentence or two that was underneath this photograph. So they were being very creative on what they had seen. But this one's, I think, really a neat one for Kaitlyns, because she's a sophomore this year, and last year had done something that would have been more similar to this. She had come from the what's going on in this picture exercise that we do with the World History Honors freshmen. So she got a chance to both do what's going on in this picture, and it was a picture of a graph. So I'm going to pass over to Kaitlyns to have her talk a few minutes.
Yeah, I really liked this one because at first when I clicked on it, I actually thought I was on what's going on in this picture, and I tried to figure out, I thought I was on the wrong website. But then as I kept looking at it, and this is something that I really like about the whole exercise, is how it's helped me in just reading graphs. Like when you look at it, at first you're kind of confused and you don't really know what it's about, but then you're thinking, okay, let me look for a key, let me look for little side notes that can help lead me in the right direction as to what the graph is talking about. So then when I scrolled down, I found out what it was about, and I thought it was really interesting how I was able to use the information that they gave about, this is public transportation in Germany, and connect it to an actual scarf. And I think it's just so interactive, and it really facilitates critical thinking. So I definitely like this one a lot.
It's really been a great exercise for the government kids. The government AP government exam was redesigned. It's going to be the first one that's different in May, and all this stuff came out last summer and included, okay, there's now a free response question on quantitative analysis, which of course scared the heck out of the history teacher here. But really, I think the resources that the Learning Network's putting up here has really made a lot of my students more comfortable with what they see in these different graphs, and I think it will pay off pretty well as they try to do that analysis come May.
All right. Thank you so much to Greg and Caitlin and Ellie. Thank you. And again, if the audience has any questions for them, we'll have a chance for Q&A at the end. If you have specific questions, please feel free to ask. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to point out that we've been looking at a bunch of different graphs that we've used for what's going on in this graph. So this one that's on your screen right now is about military spending by country. I think, Sharon, that may be the graph that had the most responses of all. I'm not entirely sure. It's certainly up there.
Yeah, to our shock, we thought we'd get no responses. That had the most responses.
Right. Lots of people had lots to say about that particular graph. So let me reintroduce Dan again. Dan, who I said is the Chief Academic Officer at Desmos. We've decided to do a collaboration together. And so, Dan, maybe you could talk about how Desmos sees this feature and why you think it adds something to what you're trying to do in math education.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, folks. This is Dan Meyer here from Oakland, California. I'm the head of teaching at Desmos, and we loved the feature at the New York Times website. We loved seeing students do more with graphs than just apply operational or computational thinking to it, like more than just, so what is the value in July? But rather this almost bringing the humanities into mathematics with questions about interpretation, social and creative work. We just love the premise of it, and what we wanted was to get the work of the A.S.A. and NYT to the largest audience possible. We have a lesson delivery platform that's used in math ed tech classes, like classes that have technology. It's free, allows teachers to deliver lessons online that are engaging and creative. And so what we decided to do was to adapt what we saw on the New York Times website in collaboration with these organizations, so that teachers could run their own mini forums inside their classes. So if they had students that were too young to participate in the public New York Times forum, or if they wanted to run their own class level version of this, they could go to our website, grab a link to any of those activities, and run their own class. And students would type in their noticings and wonderings, and teachers would see those stream into a dashboard, be able to select interesting responses and present them for class discussion. You can head to teacher.desmos.com and search for what's going on in this graph to see what we've been up to. There's also links in the New York Times article versions as well, teacher.desmos.com. So far, we've had, since January, we rolled this out, we've had 450 teachers, including Ms. Beebe. It's awesome to hear. And 20,000 student logins over that time. So it's been enormously popular. We're really excited to see more students get access to more of this kind of thinking about graphs and current events. And from our side of things, we're seeing pop music, electronic cigarettes, and healthy foods as being the real hot button topics for users of our site.
And Dan, do you want to talk just a little bit about how the way that you use the slide decks, or how students and teachers can use the Desmos platform to use the noticing and wondering and writing a catchy headline?
Yeah, definitely. So again, you go to teacher.desmos.com, search for what's going on in this graph, and you'll see these activities pop up. You create a free account and press create class code. That creates a class code. It's like a 6-character little blurb that your students will see. They'll type that in on their laptops. We have kids in pairs oftentimes for more live discussion of what they're seeing on screens versus one-to-one, where it's a little bit too quiet for our taste. They type in that code. They see a screen that has the graph on it of the week. It has a box that says, what do you notice? And they type their noticing into that box. Same for what do you wonder, and same for the headlines. And then what happens is they also will then see, as Ms. pointed out, they'll see each other's comments as well. So it's not like you're just like talking to your laptop and that's it, but they get access to other people's contributions, can think about those. On the teacher side, the teacher gets, all 30 to 40 or however many of those noticings, wonderings, and headlines, and can press a little snapshot icon to select ones that would be useful for the entire class to see, and basically have your own moderated discussion in your classroom where you are the moderator.
Okay, thank you. I'll just take a moment to explain how this feature started. We had been doing what's going in this picture for years, where we had live moderation with photographs from the Times, but the American Statistical Association actually contacted us, I think it was maybe the summer before, maybe 2 summers ago, and it was actually Sharon Hesney, who's about to speak again, said, what do you think about, instead of doing a what's going on in this picture, we could do a what's going on in this graph using the Times graph. And that's really how this feature was born. And we've been a partner with A.S.A. since then, and they've been helping us support that feature. So So Sharon, as a representative of A.S.A., can you talk about your role and particularly how you curate these graphs from week to week and how you think about choosing the graphs for the feature?
Sure. I love curating the graphs, and I think it's really the most important part of this feature to get it rolling. The way I do it is we've got dozens of graphs. Only a few get selected. So my criteria is, my very first one is students have to be able to see themselves in the graph. They're not really interested in graphs on medical discoveries or on T-bill rates or anything. This is how we're going to get them engaged. The second thing is, I like to have a variety of graphs. So we have the real typical graphs. We have histograms and bar graphs and time series and scatter plots. But we also have some pretty unconventional graphs. We have bubble charts, heat maps, radial graphs, directed graphs. And as you already heard, last month we had the famous scarf graph, which is actually a graph with no name at all. I tend to try to get the graphs alternating between easier graphs and challenging graphs. But even with challenging graphs, remember, with what do you notice, what do you wonder, there's always something students will uncover in the most challenging graphs. Finally, we have different contexts. So we've had climate graphs, pop culture, economics, health, and college. And these also we try to vary. We've had super serious graphs, like the worldwide military budget one, which was a bubble chart, okay? We've had super silly graphs, like how males and females express love differently in their writing, and we did that for Valentine's Day. Frequently, the graphs are timed to particular events. So we had the ones on guns and mass shootings the week of the National Student Walkout. We had a graph on air travel for Thanksgiving, which was a directed graph over November. And we're going to have baseball right before opening day, which will be our last graph. Let's take a look at a couple of the graphs that haven't been shown so far. September, we had a graph on migrants worldwide. It's a directed graph, and I like graphs where there's a surprise, something that you don't expect. Quickly look to the right and see what's going on in Asia in this graph. The next graph was last April, when we had where pop singers are streamed by location on a heat map. And again, there were 50 of these graphs. We showed 4 initially. There's surprises like Luke Bryan. Why do people in Maine listen to him? That's kind of an interesting question. Okay, next map. Around the time when students are starting to look at which colleges they're going to go to, we had an interactive infograph on college debt costs. And here students could either put in the amount of money they thought they were going to borrow, or actually put in the name of the college, and it would tell them what the expected amount would be. It would come out with a lot of statistics, including how much money they would have to make on a job to pay off the debt they would be taking on to go to that particular college. I think that was a great one for guidance counselors, and we've had quite a few graphs that are good for guidance counselors. Lastly, we have a graph that, as we stat teachers like to say, unimodal and symmetric, not normal, which is the summer temperatures over time from 1951 to the present. And they superimposed on top of each other, moving, as you can see here, to the right. Temperatures were getting hotter. And if you also look at it, the tails are getting a whole lot fatter. So this is one of our climate change graphs that's in, Michael will tell you about the portfolio of climate change graphs that we put together.
And I'd like to emphasize the point that in this slideshow, we can't show you the dynamic nature or interactivity of many of these graphs, but a number of our graphs, not all of them, are actually interactive, where students can input information, they can hover over certain data points and get more information. Sometimes the graphs actually move, like the summer temperatures graph, where it moves over time. So I think that's an engaging aspect of many of the Times graphs. Sharon just made reference to sort of a lesson plan, what we call, but it was really a teaching resource related to graphs that I just want to take a moment to talk about. We collected 24 New York Times graphs that were related to climate change, related to the causes and effects, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the ocean temperatures, and atmospheric temperatures. We put them all together, and in the beginning, we framed it using the pedagogy that we use for what's going on in this graph to provide teachers with some ideas on how they can use these 24 different graphs. It's been really popular, and if we have a chance, I've seen that the Times, I think, has published at least 2 more graphs related to climate change since we published it, so perhaps this feature can grow. We want to make sure that I know people have been asking questions in the Q&A, and they've been typing in questions in the chat, and many of them I hope have been able to be answered. But I wanted just to remind you before I move on, if you have any questions, please type them in. We definitely have time for Q&A, and we have lots of guests that can address them. While some questions are coming in, I just want to say a word about our sister feature, what's going on in this picture. It's been referenced a number of times, but for anyone who's interested, there we publish a new photo every Monday. We have live moderation with the organization Visual Thinking Strategies on Mondays, and we use 3 similar questions to notice and wonder. In this case, what's going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? And what more can you find? So let me say that there have been some questions coming through. So one question that somebody asked was that they felt a little bit frustration because they were getting some sort of box that came up that said they reached their limit of New York Times articles. I just want to tell people that if you're on the Learning Network and you're in the activities for students and that box comes up, you can just continue to click through and you should be able to pass through. It's just an automatic box that comes up. But for our student activities, there should be no limit. It should be completely free. So let me see. Are there any questions coming in?
Catherine. It's more a suggestion than a question, but I just love it, and I kind of throw it out to you, Sharon, as the more or less the intellectual powerhouse behind what we choose and what we do with it. But Russ L. says some graphs are so hard because they're poorly constructed. Do you ever discuss how the graphs could be made more effective? Now, of course, they come from the New York Times, and we like to think they're perfectly constructed, but I do think it's a really interesting question to have kids think about alternative ways they could be done. So, yes, we do discuss it, because if a student says, I notice, I wonder, this seems to be poorly constructed. I mean, I alluded to it in the electricity generation graph. There's something strange about those crossovers and what's the area underneath and the white spaces. And so we did have a few students who mentioned that. And then I did ask them, so how would you do it differently? Okay. But they are graphs from the Times. And so in general, they're actually constructed rather well. But there are issues with all graphs.
Are there any other questions that are coming in? So somebody asked right now, it looks like just sort of how does the feature work? So students will log in, they have to register once, and then they have to log in just like you would log into any other site, and they'll have their commenting name. They can use their real name or a username, however they want to do that. And then they can come on actually anytime after we publish the graph on a Thursday. They can comment at any time up into the actual live moderation on Wednesdays, or they can even actually comment after that. All of our archived graphs are open for commenting. So, and then on the Thursday after we have the live moderation, that's when Sharon will publish the reveal that Sharon and whoever our colleagues are for that week publish and provide the information with the stat nuggets. And so that's how the basic weekly cycle works. Looks like we have another question from Ryan, and I think this is for Stephanie. As an instructional coach, Stephanie, can you explain how you ended up doing these graphs across the disciplines? And the question actually reminds me of how you worked with the social studies department, I think, or you're planning a professional development with the social studies department. How have you worked with, or how do you plan on working with these graphs across disciplines, Stephanie?
Sure. Yes, I worked with the social studies department at my building. The department chair asked me to come in and do a presentation to the entire department. And what we did was we actually used both what's going on in this graph and what's going on in this picture. And our topic really was differentiation. And we wanted to give students and teachers a way to allow students multiple ways to access content. And so what we had done is within each of the PLCs, we found a picture or a graph that was current to their curriculum. And then we showed them the I Notice, I Wonder strategy on how they can use it and a variety of other strategies. And it was amazing because I think within the first couple of weeks after that presentation, 6 social studies teachers came up to me and said, oh, I used this, I used a variation of it. And now we're presenting for our district together to share it with the rest of the district on how a math teacher and a social studies teacher are using the same resource.
Thanks, Stephanie. We have another question from Pamela, who wants to know, would we venture into historical charts that shed new light on major events from history, or are the topics only going to be current? Well, the answer to that question is we use New York Times graphs. That's part of our mission, and that's what we have the ability to do. So the Times publishes graphs about pretty much any topic, and if they publish a graph about history, such as about medicine or monarchies or anything like that, and it feels relevant, Sharon will be taking a look at it, and we'll decide if we want to use it for what's going on in this graph. So but we really have to choose from the ecosystem of the New York Times. That's where we're getting our graphs for this feature. I'll put a call out if there's any other questions. And while we're looking for some questions, I do want to ask one.
I just maybe if you didn't already make totally clear what's going on in this picture. Somebody asked it, and I think a lot of people don't understand. That publishes pretty much simultaneously as we have the discussion because an image is pretty easy to look at and discuss. So it's up super early Monday mornings. We have the discussion Monday morning. What's going on in this graph, by contrast, teachers want to have some time to think about, should we work with it? You know, is this a topic that fits my curriculum? Maybe I need to think about the graph a little. So we always publish it by Thursday. So it goes into our Friday newsletter. I put the link to our newsletter in the chat box. And then you have a few days to decide how to use it, think about your own curriculum, and then the live discussion happens the following Wednesday.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine, for clarifying that. And I want to, this is a question from Javier about how much time do teachers typically spend on this type of activity. So this could be a question for Greg or Stephanie, but I think even to be able to talk about some of the practical details of how you use this feature in your class. Are students coming in? Do you have one-to-one computing? Are they doing it for homework as an assignment? Are you having the discussion in class? How many minutes of class period are you using? Could you talk about some of those practical details?
Sure. I've used it a variety of ways. Yesterday, we actually wound up taking the entire class period. So we had the students do the I Notice, I Wonder in just kind of looking at the graph, creating their own, sharing those ideas with a partner, building on those, getting kind of a team consensus. Then we went to Desmos, and then they shared kind of what they thought were their best I Notice, I Wonders, and then was able to look through previous students' responses and continue to make claims. I've used it as an intro for 10 or 15 minutes, like I mentioned earlier. I was really trying to stress for students to be able to make claims about their work and provide mathematical evidence. And so one way that I used it was for 15 minutes, and that was that nutrition graph. So it was an intro. I've also given it to students where I've given multiple previous graphs. And what I really like about that too is if you do use ones that are used previously, you do already have the reveal with all the critical thinking questions. I don't know if we mentioned that, but they always provide us critical thinking questions to ask our students. And so I've given students choice. So here's a couple different graphs that you can choose from, and then here are some questions for you to think about and respond to. That's how I've used it within my own classroom.
And Greg, if you could talk about how you use it, we've noticed for years that A.S.A students seem to be on early in the morning, sometimes on days after the moderation. What's going on in your classroom?
Primarily, it's done on their own. I do ask them to try to make their initial comments during the live moderation, so they can take part in that conversation. When the school year begins in September, usually we'll start off with kind of doing it as a group, as a do now, the beginning in September, so they get some more of a general idea, like the whole group gets an idea of how to interact with the materials. But as they go through, it's a given that every Wednesday the government kids are supposed to log on during the live moderation to participate in the discussion. Every Monday, the World History Honors kids are to log on, and sometimes they'll do it ahead of time, before school starts. I think that's some of the earliest ones. I think a few years they were racing to be the first post every once in a while. But in general, I like to have them do it when they can interact with the moderators and the other students.
And Caitlin and Ellie, I'm kind of curious about your experience. Do you come back to the site to see if anybody responded? How do you know that there's a conversation going on or that the moderator has responded to one of your comments?
Once I post my initial post, I always check back. I'm checking back probably 3 or 4 times a day after the initial post, because there are sometimes questions. I want to see if there are answers to questions I've asked, and I also like to see if a moderator has commented.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I think it's really interesting to see how people have kind of built off of my ideas, and if people responded to the questions that I asked, I like to go back and check throughout the day. I
don't know if it's that this feature is a little bit younger than what's going on in this picture, or that the students are upperclassmen, but they seem better with this carrying on the conversation. My other kids will ask questions about what's going on in this picture, but sometimes that feature gets so popular that there are 600-700 comments, and I think they can't find their comments sometimes.
Right, that could be frustrating, especially when there's in the hundreds or sometimes in the thousands of comments. So I want to make sure we're coming to the final minutes of the webinar. I just want to make sure that for anyone who's new to the Learning Network, that you're familiar with some of our other content. Not only do we have what's going in this graph and what's going in this picture, but we have student opinion prompts that we publish daily, picture prompts that we publish daily. We have an article of the day, film club, a weekly news quiz, country of the week quiz, a word of the day. We have contests all year long, including right now we have our editorial contest, and we'll be having our summer reading contest this summer, a poetry contest in April. And we also offer lesson plans for teachers. So I encourage you to come to the Learning Network if you've not explored the site and take a look around. If you liked what you participated in today, then you can know that there will be this webinar available on demand using, I think, the same link. There's a resource page, resource list that includes all the URLs for not only for example, the 24 climate change graph and what's going in this graph and our other features. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter. And I finally want to really encourage you, if you're interested in what we're offering on the Learning Network and in what's going in this graph, like Catherine had said, we publish what's going in the new graph each week in our newsletter. It's a great way to stay on top of what's going on the Learning Network and what graphs are coming up for your students. So I encourage you, please sign up for that if you're interested. I want to thank all of the presenters who joined us today. So first of all, Sharon and from A.S.A. and Dan from Desmos, but also the teachers, Stephanie and Greg, and our students who joined us as well. I was really impressed with how they spoke about this feature.
Can I jump in to say in the chat box, I don't know how many people said the kids on this webinar sound like adults. So thank you, guys.
So, thank you, Shannon, David, Caitlin, and Ellie. We appreciate your time and sharing with us your experience. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. The hour has come to an end. We'll have more webinars at the end of the summer or in the fall. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.